In my universe, the universe of clinical psychology, there is no room for ghosts. There are only structures, patterns, and the elegant, if sometimes tortuous, logic of the human mind. My name is Dr. Samuel Parrish, and for more than 20 years, my career was a monument to reason. I viewed the psyche not as some mysterious abyss, but as an intricate clockwork mechanism. If a gear was bent, if a pendulum was out of sync, there was a cause, a reason that could be found, analyzed, and hopefully corrected. This wasn't just a professional opinion. It was the core of my identity. I built my reputation on this certainty. In symposiums and in publications, I was a staunch defender of the scientific method against the rising tide of what I considered mysticism masquerading as therapy. While others spoke of past lives or spiritual afflictions, I spoke of cognitive behavioral loops and repressed traumatic memory. The mind, I argued, was not haunted by spirits, but by the very real echoes of lived experience. My job, especially in the field of hypnosis, which I treated with the sterile precision of a surgeon, was to be an archaeologist of memory, not an exorcist. In 1975, in the controlled environment of a university clinic in Ann Arbor, Michigan, this certainty was the bedrock upon which my entire professional world stood. It was a foundation I believed to be unshakable, forged in data, logic, and empirical observation. Every patient was a puzzle, yes, but a puzzle with a solution contained within the box. I had no earthly idea that I was about to encounter a case that would not just shake this foundation, but would take a sledgehammer to it, demolishing it completely, brick by rational brick, until I was left standing in the rubble of my own convictions. The epicenter of this intellectual earthquake was a patient named Laura Baxter. If I were asked to describe her in one word, that word would be unremarkable. And I do not use that term pejoratively. From a clinical standpoint, her normalcy was her most defining feature. A 37-year-old housewife, a mother of two, married to an accountant named Bill. Her life was a tapestry, woven with the threads of suburban American normality in the mid-1970s. She dressed in simple department store blouses and slacks, spoke in a soft, hesitant voice, and her chief complaint, the reason she was sitting in the worn leather chair opposite me, was migraines. These were not mere headaches. They were chronic, debilitating episodes that stole days of her life, leaving her incapacitated in a darkened room. The neurologists had exhausted their options. They had scanned her brain, tested her reflexes, and prescribed a litany of medications that had done nothing but produce side effects. As was common then, when the body presented a mystery, the problem was handed to people like me, labeled psychosomatic, a polite word for, we cannot find a physical cause, so it must be in your head. To me, she was the perfect textbook case. A seemingly placid life, yet an inexplicable physical pain. The protocol was clear. Use hypnosis to bypass her conscious defenses and find the source of repressed stress or trauma that was manifesting as physical agony. She was, in essence, a blank canvas, and I was confident that somewhere beneath the surface, I would find the signature of the artist of her affliction. Her file was thin, her history clean. There was nothing to suggest the profound anomaly that lay dormant within her. Our first several sessions unfolded with an almost soporific predictability. The environment itself was meticulously designed to be calming and uneventful, a beige and brown cocoon insulated from the outside world. My office was a sanctuary of earth tones, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves containing the collected wisdom of Freud, Jung, Skinner, and others, the giants upon whose shoulders I stood. The only sound, besides our voices, was the gentle hum of the reel-to-reel tape machine in the corner. My research nurse, Alice Weaver, a young woman in her late 20s whose quiet efficiency I had come to rely on, would prepare the equipment with a practiced precision. She would label the tape, check the levels, and then sit in the adjacent observation room, a silent witness transcribing our sessions through a one-way mirror. Alice was a pragmatist, utterly unimpressed by the supposed mysteries of the mind. To her, it was a job. I would guide Laura into a trance with the same even cadenced voice I had used on hundreds of patients. We wandered the mundane corridors of her memory. We spoke of her childhood in a small Ohio town, of the anxiety she felt before holiday parties, of a forgotten argument with her husband over a household budget. Each session ended in precisely the same manner. Laura would emerge from the trance, feeling rested and calm, but the migraines would inevitably return, sometimes within hours, with the same unyielding, punishing intensity. We were going nowhere, and the clean pages of my notepad reflected the utter lack of progress. After the fourth session, I began to feel a familiar sense of clinical frustration. Laura was an excellent hypnotic subject. She entered a deep trance easily and was highly responsive to suggestion. This, paradoxically, made the lack of progress even more vexing. Usually, a resistant patient presented a clear obstacle to overcome. With Laura, there were no obstacles. The doors of her subconscious were wide open, but all the rooms were empty. There was no monster hiding in the closet of her past, no single explosive traumatic event that would explain the sheer severity of her symptoms. We unearthed a childhood fear of thunderstorms and a lingering insecurity about her performance in a high school play. We discovered a mild resentment toward a sister who seemed to excel at everything effortlessly. These were the psychological equivalents of skinned knees and minor bruises, hardly the stuff of crippling, life-altering pain that left her bedridden for days on end. Alice and I would review the tapes, and the transcripts read like the biography of the most well-adjusted person in America. My initial confidence began to wane, replaced by the methodical, dispassionate process of elimination. The machine of science was working perfectly, but the data it was producing was uniformly negative. The equation remained stubbornly unbalanced, and I was beginning to suspect a fundamental variable was missing, one I feared was beyond the scope of my entire field. By the 7th session, I was on the verge of closing the file. My notes from that week, which I still possess, reflect my conclusion that her condition was likely purely neurological in origin, and that our exhaustive exploration of her psyche had served only to definitively rule out psychological causes. It's a necessary, if unglamorous, part of the job. Sometimes the most valuable thing a psychologist can do is to confidently say, "The problem isn't here." I was preparing to write my final report, to refer her back to her neurologist with the recommendation that they explore more aggressive, perhaps even experimental medical treatments. In my mind, the case was becoming a dead end, a quiet failure of the psychogenic hypothesis I had been so sure of. I remember looking at her as she rested in a deep trance, the picture of placid tranquility and feeling a profound sense of resignation. The intricate clockwork of her mind, it seemed, was perfectly sound. The problem had to be in the hardware, not the software. I was ready to move on to other patients, other puzzles that actually had solutions. That sense of closure, that clean, rational decision to admit defeat and move on, was the last moment of true professional certainty I would know for the rest of my life. I was standing at the edge of a cliff, believing I was on solid ground. It happened during our 8th session, a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The sky outside was a flat gray canvas, and the air in my office felt heavy and still. I was leading her through a procedural regression, asking her to return to a time when she felt completely at peace. It was a last-ditch effort, a technique to establish a mental baseline of comfort that we could perhaps use as an anchor against the onset of her pain. She described a memory of sitting by a lake at age 16. The sun was warm, the details were vivid and calm. It was another dead end, another idyllic scene from a life seemingly devoid of shadow. Then, I asked a standard, innocuous question, one I had asked hundreds of times before. "Is there anyone else there with you, Laura?" The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the thoughtful pause of someone searching a memory. It was a deep, profound stillness, as if the connection to my voice had been severed. The needle on the biofeedback monitor, which had been tracking her steady state of relaxation with a gentle wave pattern, suddenly twitched, a sharp, erratic spike. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, my professional curiosity piqued. "Laura?" I prompted gently. From her lips came a sound, a low, guttural whisper that was utterly alien in the quiet, sterile room. It was only 2 words, but they were sharp, and they were not English. It sounded like, "Was Will Stew?" The air in the room seemed to crystallize around the sound. My first reaction was not alarm, but intense, immediate analysis. My mind, a library of diagnoses and phenomena, instantly flipped to the correct index card. Cryptomnesia, hidden memory. The brain is a sponge, an indiscriminate recorder of sensory input. She must have heard the phrase somewhere, a war movie watched late at night, a background character on a television show, perhaps a snippet of conversation overheard in passing years ago. And it had been stored away, emerging now under the disinhibited state of hypnosis. It was the only logical explanation that preserved the integrity of my worldview. I made a note on my legal pad, carefully writing the sounds out phonetically. I kept my voice perfectly level, a practiced calm I did not entirely feel inside. "Can you repeat that, Laura?" I asked, my tone one of gentle curiosity. She stirred on the chair, her brow furrowing as if in confusion beneath her closed eyelids. I think I was dreaming," she said, her voice once again her own, soft and familiar. "Just a strange dream." I noted her response. An anomaly, a fascinating but ultimately explainable piece of data. My rational mind had already processed it, categorized it, and filed it neatly away. But there was another part of me, a deeper, more instinctual part, that felt a profound sense of intellectual dread. It was a single data point that did not fit, and it felt heavier, colder, and far more significant than it should have. For the next week, that single anomalous data point became an intellectual splinter in my mind. I couldn't dislodge it. During the day, I saw other patients, but my thoughts kept returning to the tape of that session. At night, I sat in my study and listened to that moment over and over again. The phrase was faint, but it was clear. It was not slurred or dreamlike. It was articulated. My attempts to find its origin were fruitless. I asked Laura in our next pre-session chat if she had any exposure to the German language or any German heritage. She just looked at me with genuine confusion. My grandparents were from Ireland and England, Doctor. I think I got a C in high school French, if that helps, she had said with a nervous laugh. According to all my training, I should have ignored it, treated it as an irrelevant outlier, and focused on the dominant pattern of our sessions, which was a pattern of nothing. But my scientific curiosity, the very trait that made me a good psychologist, wouldn't allow it. It was a deviation from the baseline, and deviations must be understood before they can be dismissed. It was with a sense of trepidation masquerading as clinical interest that I began our 9th session. My stated goal was to deliberately guide her back to that moment, to poke at the anomaly and see if it would repeat. I told myself I was simply being thorough. I was not prepared for what would happen when I did. I thought I was investigating a memory. I was actually about to knock on a door I never knew existed. I brought Laura into a deep trance, deeper than usual, using a slow, progressive relaxation technique. The room was silent except for my voice and the soft whir of the tape machine. I guided her back, not to the memory of the lake, but to the moment of the dream, the moment she spoke those alien words. "Oh, Laura," I said, my voice a calm instrument of inquiry, a surgeon's scalpel intended for a precise, exploratory incision. "I want you to go back to the sound you made last week. The dream. What was happening in that dream?" For a long time, there was nothing. A full minute passed. I could feel my own heart beating, a steady, rhythmic intrusion into the expectant silence. I was about to abandon the attempt to pull her back when the change began. It was not a sound. It was a slow, horrifying physical transformation. Her relaxed hands, which had been resting limply on the arms of the chair, began to curl, knuckle by knuckle, into tight, weathered fists, as if gripping a tool or a weapon. Her shoulders, which were usually sloped in a posture of gentle deference, squared themselves, becoming broad and defiant. The muscles in her jaw tightened, and a look of profound, weary anger seemed to carve itself into her sleeping features. Her breathing deepened, becoming heavier, more labored. A sound from the chest, not the throat. It was as if I were watching clay being remolded on a potter's wheel by an unseen, hostile artist. The serene housewife from Ann Arbor was disappearing before my very eyes, being replaced by someone harder, older, and forged in a fire I couldn't comprehend. She lifted her head from the headrest of the chair. It was a slow, deliberate movement, imbued with an unfamiliar weight and authority. Her eyes remained closed, but I had the distinct and unnerving sensation that she was staring directly at me, through me. When she spoke, the sound that filled my office was a shock, both auditory and visceral. It was not Laura's voice. It had none of her soft, hesitant cadence. This voice was a low, raspy, guttural instrument, filled with a texture of gravel and a weary contempt. It was the voice of a stranger, and it spoke not in a whispered phrase, but in a torrent of that same foreign language. It was a cascade of harsh consonants and unfamiliar vowels, delivered with a defiant fluency that was utterly chilling. This was not a memory of a phrase. This was speech. It wasn't directed at me as a therapist. The tone was one of indignant response, as if I were an interrogator, an accuser she had been contending with for a very long time. In that moment, the sterile, scientific sanctity of my office was shattered. The rules of psychology, of memory, of personality, they had all just been rendered obsolete. The session was no longer a therapy session. It had become something else entirely, something for which I had no name and no protocol. I was no longer the one in control. I was completely out of my depth, a cartographer whose ship had just sailed off the edge of the map. But years of training took over, a kind of clinical autopilot that forced me to observe, to document. I signaled to Alice in the observation room. Her face, visible through the glass, was a mask of pale, wide-eyed disbelief. I needed a witness, but more than that, I needed to end the session. I used a calm but firm command to bring Laura back to full consciousness. The process was jarring. The foreign voice stopped mid-sentence. Her body went limp for a moment, and then she awoke with a gasp, shivering despite the warmth of the room. She felt cold, she said, a deep, bone-aching cold, and had a splitting headache. She had no memory of what had transpired. The following morning, I made the most difficult and professionally risky call of my career. I contacted Dr. Adler, a distinguished professor of linguistics at the university, an older man with a reputation for academic rigor and a low tolerance for foolishness. I framed my request carefully, describing a patient with a unique linguistic delusion. He was skeptical, but his curiosity won out. He agreed to listen to the tape. He arrived at my office that afternoon, a man exuding an air of weary intellectual superiority. I led Dr. Adler into my office and offered him my own chair. I stood by the tape machine like a nervous junior researcher presenting his thesis. I felt a desperate need for his expertise to provide a rational explanation, to tell me this was a clever, if complex, form of gibberish, a known psychological phenomenon. I needed him to restore order to my world. I played the tape, He put on the headphones, leaning back with his eyes closed, listening with an air of detached analysis. The section with Laura's normal voice elicited no reaction. Then came the change. I watched his face. At first, his brow furrowed in concentration. He motioned for me to rewind and play it again. I did. He listened a second time, his head cocked to one side. On the third listen, his entire demeanor changed. The academic detachment vanished, replaced by an expression of stunned, rapt attention. He opened his eyes and they were wide, fixed on some distant point. When the tape ended, he took the headphones off slowly, placing them on the desk as if they were a sacred artifact. He stared at me for a long moment, his face pale. "Dr. Parrish," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "where did you get this?" I explained again, briefly. He shook his head in disbelief. "This is not a delusion," he said, his voice filled with a strange mix of excitement and fear. "This is a fluent, responsive, and grammatically complex dialect of High German, the kind that hasn't been commonly spoken in over 300 years. Dr. Adler's verdict was a paradigm bomb that detonated in the center of my career. It was no longer an anomaly, it was an impossibility. It was one thing for me, a psychologist, to be baffled. It was another for an expert linguist to authenticate the phenomenon as genuine. The anguish began there. Not a loud, emotional anguish, but a quiet, methodical, intellectual torment that consumed every waking hour and haunted my dreams. The Gretchen tapes, as Alice and I had nervously begun to call them, became my obsession. I canceled my other appointments. I spent my days in the university library, surrounded by dusty tomes on linguistics, history, and European folklore. My primary scientific mission now was not to cure Laura's migraines, but to disprove the impossible evidence I held in my own hands. I had to find the logical source, the exposure event. I became a detective investigating the most impossible of crimes, a crime against the known laws of reality. I started a new dossier, separate from Laura's official medical file. It was a secret document, a chronicle of my descent into a world where science had no answers. My nights were spent listening to the tapes, transcribing not just the words, but every nuance, every sigh, every tremor of anger and sorrow in that impossible, ancient voice. The full force of my obsession was directed at Laura Baxter's past. I launched a forensic investigation into her life that bordered on harassment. With her hesitant permission, I interviewed her parents, her husband, her siblings, her childhood friends. I went through family photo albums, home movies, high school yearbooks. I cross-referenced the manifest of the ship her Irish ancestors had arrived on in the 1880s. I obtained a list of every book she had ever checked out of her local library. I was searching for the source, the single data point that would make it all make sense. A German nanny in her infancy? No. A distant relative from a forgotten branch of the family tree? Her lineage was meticulously documented and uniformly British and Irish, an obscure historical novel she'd read as a teenager and forgotten? We found nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was more than just a lack of evidence. It was a perfect, hermetically sealed void of exposure. Every lead was a dead end. Every closed door reinforced the impossibility. I was a man of science, drowning in evidence for something that science vehemently, fundamentally said could not exist. The harder I looked for a logical explanation, the more magnificently, terrifyingly illogical the entire situation became. My obsession did not go unnoticed by my colleagues. I became withdrawn, distracted, my contributions at departmental meetings becoming sparse and erratic. The certain, confident doctor. Parrish was replaced by a haunted man who spoke vaguely of anomalous vocal data in a challenging case. The whispers followed me down the university corridors. Parrish was spending too much time on the Baxter case. Parrish was losing his objectivity. I attempted to present a sanitized version of my findings at a departmental review, hoping for insight, for help. I played a 30-second clip from the tapes, focusing on the linguistic complexity, and presented Dr. Adler's initial analysis. The response was a wall of polite, dismissive skepticism. They saw it not as a mystery to be solved, but as a symptom of my own failing judgment. They suggested it was a fascinating, if elaborate, form of folie à deux, a shared delusion between a highly suggestible patient and an overly invested doctor. They recommended I take a leave of absence. I was not just being marginalized, I was being pathologized. My own tools of diagnosis were being turned against me. I was becoming an outcast in the very church where I had once been a high priest. Alice, my nurse, provided no solace. Her fear was a constant, unnerving counterpoint to my intellectual torment. While I grappled with the data, she grappled with the visceral reality of the phenomenon. She had begun to dread our sessions with Laura. She told me that transcribing the Gretchen tapes felt like listening to a ghost, and she would only do it during the day with all the lights in her office on. She started making excuses to be absent, citing illness or family emergencies. She confessed to me one afternoon that she'd started having nightmares of a woman with a strange voice calling to her from a dark field. Her pragmatism had been shattered, replaced by a primal fear that I, in my scientific arrogance, was trying to suppress. She was the canary in my scientific coal mine, a warning of the spiritual toxicity of what we had unearthed, and she was suffocating. I tried to reassure her with talk of psychological projection and shared anxiety, but the words sounded hollow even to me. She was feeling the phenomenon, while I was merely thinking about it, and her fear was beginning to feel more rational than my denial. Her breaking point, and perhaps the moment my own denial truly began to crumble, came during the 12th session. We were deep into a dialogue with the Gretchen personality. I was asking questions, translated for me by a reluctant doctor. Adler, about her life, her time. The atmosphere was thick with tension. Suddenly, the building's power grid failed. The lights went out, the hum of the equipment died, and we were plunged into sudden absolute darkness and silence. My emergency recorder, a small battery-operated device, kept running, its tiny red light the only point of reference in the blackness. In the pitch dark, I heard a sharp gasp from Alice in the observation room. And then a new sound, a whisper that did not come from the patient on the couch, but seemed to emanate from the corner of the room to my left. It was Gretchen's voice, raw with terror, and it whispered in German, "Sie kommen, um mich wieder zu verbrennen." They are coming to burn me again. A second later, the emergency lights flickered on with a hum. Laura was sitting bolt upright on the chair, wide awake, screaming, her eyes wide with a terror she couldn't explain. She had no memory of how she got there. I now had a recording of an anomalous voice in a dark room that came from a location where no one was sitting. The true crucible of my anguish was listening to the tapes, alone, at night, in the sterile silence of my office, with the city a grid of distant, silent lights outside my window. I would thread the reel-to-reel, the soft click and whir of the machine, the only sound, and I would listen. Gretchen was more than just a voice speaking a dead language. She had a personality. She was stubborn, fearful, proud, and filled with an ancient, profound sorrow. Through our translated sessions, she spoke of her life in a 17th century village I could not find on any map. She described the feel of raw wool, the taste of black bread, the terror of being accused of witchcraft by the village pastor after her son fell ill. She recounted the interrogations, the cold of the cell, the faces of her accusers, with details so vivid, so historically consistent, they felt like memories. It was the raw emotional content that truly broke through my clinical defenses. I am a psychologist. I'm trained to detect fabrication, to understand the architecture of a delusion. This felt like none of those. The pure, unadulterated trauma in that voice as she described her fear of the fire, it felt real. I was listening to the recorded testimony of a woman who had been dead for over 300 years. And the tool I was using, psychology, was serving as a conduit for a voice that shouldn't exist. My science had become a seance. After 4 months, I had compiled a dossier nearly 1,000 pages long. It contained transcripts, the complete linguistic analysis by Dr. Adler and 2 of his international colleagues, a full genealogical breakdown of Laura Baxter's family tree, and my own exhaustive, meticulously documented failed search for a rational explanation. The data was complete, ironclad, and utterly impossible. I stood at a professional and existential crossroads. Option 1, I could publish. I could present the Gretchen tapes to the world, a definitive, documented case of what? I didn't even have a word for it. Xenoglossia? Reincarnation? I knew what would happen. My career would be over. I would be a laughingstock, a pseudoscientist, a cautionary tale told to psychology graduate students for generations. My 20 years of credible research would be annihilated by one impossible case. Option 2, I could bury it, I could classify the tapes, lock away the dossier, and pretend it never happened. I could protect my career, my reputation, my carefully constructed reality. It was the ultimate conflict for a man of science. Do you follow the data, even if it leads you off the edge of the known world? Or do you protect the integrity of the map you have spent your life creating? I made my choice. I ended my sessions with Laura. I took the 15 reel-to-reel tapes, placed them in a metal box, and locked them in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet. It was an act of professional self-preservation. It was also the most profound intellectual cowardice of my life. I never practiced hypnotherapy again. The tool was tainted. It had shown me something I couldn't unsee, or rather, couldn't unhear. I continued my career, but the foundation was gone. My belief in the neat, orderly explanations of the human mind had been permanently fractured. The world was no longer a solvable equation to me. It was a place of deep, dark, and inexplicable mystery. Laura Baxter's migraines eventually faded on their own a few years later. We never spoke again. I often wonder if she ever feels a shadow within her, a cold spot on a warm day, the echo of a voice that is not her own. The Gretchen tapes remain locked away. They are a monument to the failure of my science, or perhaps to its limits. They are evidence that sometimes the data doesn't fit the model. Sometimes the data is the monster. It raises the ultimate question for any person of science, for any rational mind. What do you do when the only logical conclusion is that logic itself is insufficient? That case taught me that the most terrifying anomalies aren't the ones you can see, but the ones you can measure. From what city are you watching this? What time is it there? Because a case like this makes you question the very ground you're standing on. If this case disturbs you as much as it has disturbed me for decades, leave a like, so more people can confront these unexplained medical mysteries. And if you want to explore more files that challenge everything we think we know about the laws of nature, subscribe and join this investigation into the impossible. Share this video with someone you know who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions. You can check out the playlist below for more documented cases that changed everything I thought I knew about medicine. Because some records were never meant to be explained.